hi, my name is Nan Zhang. I am a MW Fellow, and I'm here with Professor David Laitin, who's here at the UI with us to present his new book. So David is a professor of political science at Stanford University, and also my former dissertation advisor. His research focuses on political culture, identity, and civil conflict, and he draws upon field work from Europe and also from sub-Saharan Africa. He is the author of several books, including Identity and Formation, Nation, States, and Violence, and most recently, Why Muslim Integration Fails in Christian Heritage Societies, co-authored with C.L.Adida and M-C.Valfort, to be appearing in Harvard University Press. So we thought we would do a short interview for some people who couldn't be here today for David's talk. And I just wanted to start by asking you, maybe you could briefly describe your main research questions as well as the main findings of your book.
The research question is a very simple one, and that is, do Muslim immigrants into France in particular, or Europe more generally, face higher barriers to integration than if everything about them were the same, but they weren't Muslim? And in technical language, that means identifying a Muslim effect as opposed to a foreigner effect or other things that might influence whether migrants are successful integrating into Europe. The initial finding in our research, based upon an experiment where we send CVs, resumes of job seekers to French firms, we compared the success of two Senegalese applicants, one Khadija Diouf, the other Marie Diouf, and each of them competed against a third person with the exact same qualifications, Aurélie Menard. And we found that compared to Khadija Diouf, Marie got 2.5 times the number of callbacks for interviews than Khadija. And we said this is a clear example of discrimination. And the rest of the research used surveys and used experimental game theory in the 19th arrondissement of Paris to try to figure out what the mechanisms were that sustained the discrimination. One more thing, which is crucial for future questions, is what we call the identification strategy. So if we had compared, say, how Algerians who are 85–90% of the Muslims in France, if we had asked how well they were doing, that we wouldn't know whether it was because they were Muslims, whether because they were foreigners, whether that because they were colonized and fought a war against the French. So we would be unable to determine what part or what aspect of their package, a cultural package or a historical package, was leading to discrimination. What we did is we took two groups from southwestern Senegal, the Jolas and Serres, and what makes them maybe unique for the study in France is about half of them are Muslims and half of them are Christians, and everything about them else is the same. They came from peasant families. They came to France in mid-1970s because of droughts in southwestern Senegal. They were both colonized by the French, and they're both of the same race, Africans. And we traced them for a generation and a half in France. And what we found is that the Muslim families, on average, Sarah and Jola Muslim families, were earning household income about 400 euros a month less than the Christians, which is about 15% of average income in France, and which shows not only are they discriminated against from the CV experiment, but the implications of the discrimination are significant in terms of family wealth.
Now you talk about integration in the title, and you focus specifically on the religious aspect of integration. And obviously these are sort of big topics and big issues, especially now with the refugee crisis, and people are talking a lot about these issues. What do you think, how do you think your book contributes to sort of the debates that are going on now?
So let's just be careful for a moment. The integration that we specifically focus on is integration in the labor market.
Mm-hmm.
That is how well the families are doing in getting decent jobs and better life chances. And we can call that the outcome variable or the dependent variable. The independent variable is their religion. And so the question is, with large numbers of Muslims coming in with the present refugee crisis, the question to ask is there anything we've learned from this work that will enable European governments to push for policies or orientations towards these new populations that won't put the next generation of Muslim migrants in the same position as the past generation. And so we try to look carefully as to what sustains the discrimination in the hope of finding ways in which this discrimination could be reduced, which is a fundamental challenge for policymakers today.
And do you have any policy ideas in mind?
We have a few in our final chapter. We suggest a few of these policies, but first, a major finding, and one that's somewhat controversial, is that it's not only the French who are participating in this discrimination, but in a sense, the Muslim population is picking up on a degree of distaste by the French for people of a different religion, and their reaction is to separate themselves from the French. A good indicator of this, for example, is amongst our Senegalese, a significantly more of the Muslims plan to be buried in their home country. A significant number of the Christians plan to be buried in France. So it's in a sense, they pick up signals from the French about how much they're wanted, and then they orient their lives more towards their home country than their host country. So how can we break up, we call this discriminatory equilibrium, and it requires both sides to be making moves simultaneously, because what we mean by an equilibrium, if only one side changes, that it won't bring an equilibrium shift. Both have to change their behavior. So one of the things we find, and it comes out clearly, is that HR, human resources officials in large firms, are the ones who are actually doing the rejections. And then to think, how can you break into this system? And one way we're thinking about it is to ask the State Statistical Bureau to demand that their HR bureaus be put under scrutiny for the degree to which they're discriminating. And that firms, just like firms in Europe today, are being ranked on the degree to which they're green.
Yeah.
We want them to be ranked according to which they show and can demonstrate that they don't discriminate in the application process. And we argue that if firms were to be ranked on this dimension as being discriminatory free,
Yeah.
Sort of like green, that this will make them better able to attract workers who want to be in a world of non-discrimination, and it may help them to get this certification. So that's one of a set of ideas we're thinking through, which might break this equilibrium trap.
Do you have any ideas about what moves the other side could take?
Yes. In interviews, extensive interviews by two sociologists, Bouzard and Bouzard, in interviewing the HR officials, one of the things that comes up again and again, even though the numbers are very few, of threats to the esprit de corps of the work teams when several Muslims join together to make demands on the firm. And one of them would be, having special prayer rooms.
Mhm.
Another would be having a special cafeteria. A third one would be that they should not be expected in the month of Ramadan to work the full hours. An important one is there are a few cases where waiters in restaurants have refused to serve wine to customers. And so there's now a set of regulations in France, not clearly developed, making demands or permission of firms to challenge these demands and allow them to, in a sense, fire workers that say who refuse to serve wine or who come to work not having slept and are in jobs which require high levels of skill. So we would like to see a kind of compact amongst the Islamic communities to buy into a set of practices that would say that you can be a Muslim at home, but at work there are certain things you have to do, or else you are subjecting yourself justifiably to be let go. And these practices, I should add, are practiced by very few. The percentage is less than 1% of the workers who are called for not fulfilling their jobs due to claims of religion. But in a sense, by only a few, people think of it as crucially important.
Okay.
And so they enlarge the problem by making it seem like this is happening in every firm when it's very rarely happening. But still, we think that by Muslim organizations making clear that they won't tolerate this kind of behavior of their own group, that it would reduce the ability of firms to say, we don't want to hire Muslims because during Ramadan their work is harmful to fellow workers. We just want that off the table, and I think there are ways the Muslim community can bring that off the table.
You've talked about the concept of equilibrium, and I think it's related to sort of this idea that you have, at least in the abstract of the book, about rational and irrational Islamophobia.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think for me, knowing you, I know you have a very sort of specific idea in mind when you talk about rationality. But maybe you could sort of explain a little bit more what you mean by rationality for people who haven't read the book.
So, if you think that in interaction that another group, an outgroup, will show a great deal of distrust to you, and you have this belief, then and you therefore don't trust them, we would say the behavior you have is based upon the beliefs of what the other will do. And one of the interesting things about these beliefs is if you never interact with them because of those beliefs, you'll never be able to update and learn that those beliefs are false. But we consider these beliefs about what the others will do as based upon beliefs or reasons. And there's examples of that, of the behavior of the rooted French towards the Muslims. But we also have evidence that there is a behavior by the rooted French which discriminates against Muslims even though the Muslims have no chance to react. The Muslim behavior is irrelevant to the decision of the French on how generous to be. Mm-hmm. And we consider this non-rational Islamophobia. It's not based on beliefs, it's based on feelings.
Mm. And so are the policy interventions that you've suggested sort of aimed towards targeting beliefs, or do you also have ideas about targeting feelings?
Well, it's an interesting question. We rely on an interesting study of the referees in the National Basketball Association in America. And what researchers have found is that white referees are more likely to call fouls on African American players than on the white players, and this was systematic. And by announcing this and publishing it, one of the strange things is the referees then became aware of their own distaste. And the effect went away after it was published. So the second paper showed that it was eradicated. And I believe, and I think most French people believe, that this form of discrimination fundamentally violates their Republican values, the values they hold most highly. And we believe by in a sense, publicizing this non-rational component of discrimination, it will start a conversation in France that we are not the kind of people we thought we were, and to try to compensate for it. So I think just by publicizing their systematic behavior, which discriminates against Muslims for no reason, that the French themselves will say, we can do better than this.
To what extent is this a book about France?
90% about France.
But do you think the ideas can also travel to
And we do a chapter on evidence outside of France, using data looking at, for example, Muslim and Christian Bosniaks who come to Europe. And interestingly enough, across the European states, we find similar outcomes of Christian advantage with a similar degrees of discrimination. And then we rely on a very interesting study done in the Detroit metropolitan area, where there's the largest Arab population, diaspora Arab population in the world. And we find, again, that the Christian Arabs have about the same advantage over the Muslim Arabs, controlling for a variety of skills at time of immigration. So that's why we took the big step or leap of calling it Christian heritage societies and not just France.
And this is the work with Rachel Gilliam and...
No, it's not, although Rachel helped us. But this was our own analysis of those surveys.
So before wrapping up, I did want to ask you something from a more methods perspective, which is that, so this book, I think the heart is really built on a series of clever experiments that you guys have run. And I think, especially in political science, we've moved more towards experimentation and causal inference in recent years. I think personally this is good, but at the same time, with these experiments, we're asking sort of more narrow research questions. While in comparative politics, at least, I think there's still this focus or this expectation that we want to address big issues and write big books. So from your perspective, I was wondering what advice you would have for maybe more junior scholars about how to integrate sort of experimental work in a larger research agenda or research program.
Ever since my doctoral dissertation, where I did what's now called field experiments in Somalia, asking whether bilinguals in Somali and English, if they were asked to speak politically about a certain signed topic in Somali, would it come out differently if we were asked them to discuss the same topic in English? And I found significantly different results, making large claims about the cultural implications of reliance on colonial languages. And from that dissertation, that was published in 1977, from that dissertation on, I've always believed that you should address the biggest questions, but you couldn't make any progress in asking the biggest questions unless you give carefully, narrow, micro studies that can accumulate. That if you try to answer big questions with the biggest research designs, generally you will learn nothing. So the only way we're going to learn is by taking small pieces of the larger puzzle, but linking that small piece to the big question for the reason why we became political scientists in the first place.
What's next after this book?
We now have an integration and immigration policy lab at Stanford with a colleague, Jens Heinmuller, and we have a series of studies already underway asking what policies, and not so much national policies, but more local policies, what are the local policies that are most successful in integrating migrants, immigrants or refugees. One example is in France, under President Sarkozy, they developed a program called Contracts of Welcoming and Integration, in which every immigrant has to sign a contract. And if they sign a contract, they have to go to classes on what it means to be French, but also get 400 hours of free French instruction, which is a very expensive program. What we're able to do is what's called methodologically in a regression discontinuity design, is look at the immigrants that came 6 months before they had to sign contracts and 6 months after, and ask what was the return on the investment of the contract in terms of following them for the next 5 years on how well they integrated to France. So we want to know whether these integration contracts are useful in bringing about the outcomes that most Europeans want. About, I think, 8 or 9 center-right governments in Europe have copied the Sarkozy policy, all of the copying done without any systematic analysis of whether it works. Yeah. So we're looking at a range of policies of that sort to give a better understanding of what works and what doesn't work in integrating migrants into OECD states.
Sounds like a really interesting research agenda. David, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us. I look forward to your talk tonight.